Picture this. You step off the tube at Bank Station during what should be rush hour, but something feels wrong. The usual crushing crowds are smaller. The energy that once pulsed through London's veins seems diluted. Welcome to a reality that city planners, politicians, and media outlets have been desperately trying to hide. London is emptying out, and it's happening faster than anyone wants to admit. This isn't about tourists staying away or temporary COVID effects. This is about a fundamental demographic shift that's reshaping one of the world's greatest cities in ways that would shock you. We're witnessing the quiet retirement of London itself, not just its people, but its very identity as a thriving, growing metropolis. The numbers are staggering, and they tell a story that challenges everything we thought we knew about urban growth in the 21st century. Between 2021 and 2023, London lost over 300,000 residents. That's equivalent to the entire population of Cardiff simply vanishing. But here's the kicker. These aren't random departures. They follow a pattern so precise, so targeted, that it's effectively gutting the city's most productive demographics. The Great London Exodus. Sarah Mitchell, 34, a senior marketing manager, represents the new face of London's exodus. After 8 years in a cramped Clapham flat, paying £2,200 monthly for a space barely larger than a hotel room, she made a decision that's becoming increasingly common. She left. Not for another country, but for Manchester, where she bought a 3-bedroom Victorian house for less than what she was spending on rent in London. I realized I was working just to afford the privilege of living in a city that was no longer offering me anything in return, Sarah explains. The culture I loved was being priced out along with me. The local pubs were closing, the independent shops were gone, replaced by chain stores and empty units. I was paying premium prices for a diminishing experience. Sarah's story isn't unique, it's becoming the norm. Data from the Office for National Statistics reveals that London experienced its largest population decline since World War II, with the 25-45 age group leading the charge. These are the teachers, nurses, police officers, firefighters, and mid-level professionals who form the backbone of any functional city. The ripple effects are visible everywhere, if you know where to look. Transport for London ridership remains 15% below pre-2020 levels, not because of lasting health concerns, but because there are simply fewer people to transport. Schools in inner London boroughs are facing declining enrollment, with some primary schools losing entire year groups. The housing trap that backfired. To understand how we got here, we need to examine London's housing market, a market so disconnected from economic reality that it's effectively functioning as a city-wide wealth extraction mechanism. The average house price in London now sits at £523,000, nearly 13 times the average salary. For a generation of Londoners, homeownership isn't just difficult, it's mathematically impossible. Take the case of James Rodriguez, a NHS nurse with 6 years of experience. Despite working in one of society's most essential roles, James earns £31,000 annually. Even with a partner earning a similar amount, they would need to save for 47 years to afford a 20% deposit on an average London home, assuming house prices didn't rise during that period. The absurdity of this calculation isn't lost on James, who moved to Leeds in 2023. I was living in a house share with 3 other people at age 32, splitting a £3,200 monthly rent 4 ways, James recalls. I had no privacy, no stability, and no hope of ever having a family home in the city where I was literally saving lives every day. The math just didn't work. The housing crisis isn't just about high prices, it's about the complete breakdown of the relationship between housing costs and local wages. While London wages have increased by roughly 30% over the past decade, housing costs have risen by 85%. This divergence has created what economists call a productivity paradox. The more valuable London becomes as an economic centre, the less sustainable it becomes as a place for working people to live. The demographic catastrophe, the age profile of London's departing residents, tells a particularly troubling story. The city is losing its 28 mighty's 42-year-olds at an unprecedented rate, precisely the demographic that forms families, starts businesses, and drives innovation. What's replacing them? A growing population of retirees and an increasingly transient group of very high earners who view London as a temporary posting rather than a permanent home. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a demographic researcher at King's College London, has been tracking these shifts with growing alarm. We're witnessing the creation of a demographic desert, she explains. London is simultaneously becoming older and more transient. The stable, rooted middle class that historically drove the city's culture and civic life is being systematically priced out. The data supports her concerns. Birth rates in London have dropped to their lowest levels since records began, falling 23% between 2020 and 2023. This isn't just about personal choice, it's about the impossibility of raising a family in a city where childcare costs £1,500 per month, and family-sized homes are financially out of reach for all but the wealthiest residents. Meanwhile, the number of residents over 65 has increased by 18% in the same period. These aren't new retirees moving to London for its amenities, they're existing residents aging in place while younger people leave. The result is a city that's graying faster than almost any other major metropolis in the developed world. The service economy mirage. London's economy has been increasingly built on the promise of service sector jobs, finance, consulting, legal services, and creative industries. Politicians and business leaders have celebrated this shift as evidence of London's evolution into a knowledge economy. But this narrative obscures a fundamental problem. These high-paying jobs represent a shrinking percentage of actual employment. For every investment banker earning £150,000, London needs dozens of teachers, nurses, police officers, firefighters, bus drivers, shop assistants, restaurant workers, and maintenance staff. These essential workers earn between £25,000 and £40,000 annually, wages that made sense when London housing was affordable, but are now completely inadequate. The result is a growing labour shortage in essential services. London's Metropolitan Police has 3,000 fewer officers than in 2010, not primarily due to budget cuts, but because officers can't afford to live in the areas they're meant to protect. The London Fire Brigade faces similar challenges, with recruitment drives consistently failing to attract sufficient candidates willing to accept the financial impossibility of life in London on a firefighter's salary. Restaurant owners across the city report unprecedented difficulty finding staff. It's not that people don't want these jobs, it's that they literally cannot afford to take them while living in London. The city's economy is eating itself, creating jobs that its own residents cannot afford to accept. The culture collapse. Perhaps nowhere is London's transformation more visible than in its cultural landscape. The city that gave the world punk rock, Britpop, and countless artistic movements is watching its creative soul get priced out in real time. Music venues that launched legendary careers are closing at a rate of 3 per month, replaced by luxury developments or chain restaurants targeting wealthy tourists. The Garage, where Oasis played early gigs, closed in 2019. The Astoria, demolished in 2009, was never replaced. The 12 Bars Club, the Luminaire, Madame Jojo's, the list of closed venues reads like an obituary for London's musical heritage. What's replacing them? Expensive cocktail bars and bland restaurant chains that cater to a clientele with expendable income but little connection to London's cultural legacy. Independent bookshops have suffered similarly devastating losses. Areas like Bloomsbury and Fitzrovia, once thick with second-hand bookshops and literary cafes, now host luxury clothing stores and overpriced coffee chains. The people who created and sustained London's cultural ecosystem, artists, musicians, writers, and the young people who formed their audiences, simply cannot afford to participate anymore. This isn't just about nostalgia. Cities need cultural ecosystems to remain vibrant and attractive. The same economic forces that are pricing out essential workers are also destroying the cultural infrastructure that makes London worth living in. We're witnessing the creation of a city that's simultaneously more expensive and less interesting, a combination that explains why even wealthy residents are beginning to question whether London offers sufficient value. The international exodus, the population decline, isn't limited to British nationals. London's international community, once one of its greatest strengths, is also contracting. EU citizens, despite having settled status, are leaving in significant numbers. The combination of Brexit uncertainties, high living costs, and diminishing quality of life has made other European cities more attractive. Amsterdam, Berlin, Dublin, and Copenhagen are all experiencing influxes of former London residents. These cities offer comparable career opportunities, better work-life balance, more affordable housing, and often superior public services. For the first time in generations, London is losing its competitive advantage as Europe's most dynamic city. The brain drain extends beyond Europe. Young professionals from India, Australia, Canada, and the United States, historically drawn to London for career advancement, are increasingly choosing other destinations. Singapore, Toronto, and even cities within their own countries often provide better long-term prospects than London's combination of high costs and limited opportunities for advancement. Looking at the numbers, the statistical evidence is overwhelming. London's population peaked in 2020 at approximately 9.5 million and has since contracted to roughly 9.1 million. While 400,000 might seem small in percentage terms, the composition of this decline is what makes it significant. The city has lost net contributors while gaining net dependents. Council tax revenues are stagnating despite rising rates. Business rates collections are falling as commercial properties remain vacant. The London Underground, once profitable, now requires significant government subsidies to maintain service levels. These aren't temporary COVID effects, they represent structural changes to London's economic base. Youth unemployment in London now exceeds the national average for the first time since the 1990s, not because there aren't jobs, but because the jobs that exist don't pay enough to support independent living in the city. Young people are trapped in cycles of house sharing and gig work that offer no path to stability or progression. The political silence, perhaps most disturbing, is the political response to these changes. Virtual silence. No major political party wants to acknowledge that London is contracting because it would require admitting that decades of housing and economic policies have failed. Instead, politicians continue to speak about London's growth and dynamism using data that's increasingly out of date. The Mayor's office continues to promote housing targets and business development initiatives as if the fundamental mathematics of London life hadn't changed. National politicians reference London's economic contribution without acknowledging that this contribution is becoming increasingly hollow, dependent on a shrinking base of actual residents. This denial isn't just politically convenient, it's preventing the serious policy discussions necessary to address London's crisis. Until political leaders acknowledge that London is in demographic and economic decline, they cannot begin to develop solutions. The transformation of London from a city of opportunity to a city of extraction represents one of the most significant urban policy failures of the modern era. The question isn't whether London is changing, it's whether the city that emerges from this transformation will be worth saving. The economic earthquake nobody saw coming if Act 1 revealed the human cost of London's demographic collapse. What we're about to explore is far more alarming, the economic time bomb that's been quietly ticking beneath the surface. London's economy isn't just struggling with population decline, it's facing a fundamental restructuring that threatens to hollow out the very foundations of British prosperity. The conventional wisdom says that London generates roughly 25% of UK GDP. Politicians and economists have used this statistic for decades to justify massive infrastructure investments, tax breaks for financial services, and policies that prioritize London's growth above regional development. But here's what they're not telling you, that 25% figure is increasingly misleading, based on accounting tricks and financial engineering, rather than genuine economic productivity. What's really happening is that London has become a giant wealth concentration machine, extracting value from the rest of the UK, while contributing less and less actual productive capacity. The city's apparent economic success masks a deeper rot, an economy increasingly dependent on property speculation, financial manipulation, and services that add questionable value to the real world. The social fabric tears apart. While economists debate GDP figures and politicians spin statistics, something far more profound is happening to London: the dissolution of its social fabric. The city that once prided itself on being a melting pot of cultures, classes, and communities is fragmenting into isolated enclaves of wealth and poverty, with the middle ground, literally and figuratively, disappearing entirely. This isn't just about inequality, though London now has some of the most extreme wealth disparities in the developed world. It's about the complete breakdown of the social structures that make cities livable, cohesive, and resilient. London is becoming a collection of separate worlds that barely acknowledge each other's existence. Walk through Kensington, and you'll find streets where the average house costs £5 million, where residents employ teams of staff and shop at boutiques that sell £300 candles. 5 miles away in Newham, families crowd into converted shipping containers, marketed as temporary accommodation, often spending years in spaces designed for emergency use. These aren't different neighborhoods, they're different realities, existing in parallel with minimal interaction. The social consequences of this fragmentation are profound and accelerating. Traditional community institutions, local pubs, community centers, libraries, youth clubs, are closing at unprecedented rates, not just due to funding cuts, but because the communities they serve no longer exist in coherent form. The collapse of community infrastructure. London's community infrastructure is disappearing with alarming speed. The city has lost over 400 pubs since 2010, with closures accelerating each year. These weren't just drinking establishments, they were community gathering places where people from different backgrounds could interact informally. Libraries face similar devastation. Despite increased usage during economic hardship, library opening hours have been slashed and branches closed. The Kensal Rise Library, campaigned for by authors like Zadie Smith, closed despite massive community opposition. The message was clear: communities cannot preserve their own institutions against economic forces. Community centers, youth clubs, and sports facilities follow the same pattern. Rising property values make community use financially impossible, while funding cuts eliminate public support. The spaces where London's diverse communities once mixed and formed connections are being systematically eliminated. The loss extends to informal community spaces. Local markets are being replaced by upscale food halls, targeting tourists rather than serving local residents. Independent shops that provided gathering places for specific communities, Somali cafes, Turkish barbers, Polish delicatessens, are priced out by rising rents. What's replacing these community institutions? Often nothing. Properties remain empty while owners await redevelopment opportunities, creating dead zones that further fragment neighborhood social life. Riot. The absurdity of this calculation isn't lost on James, who moved to Leeds in 2023. "I was living in a house share with 3 other people at age 32, splitting a £3,200 monthly rent 4 ways, James recalls. "I had no privacy, no stability, and no hope of ever having a family home in the city where I was literally saving lives every day. The math just didn't work." The housing crisis isn't just about high prices, it's about the complete breakdown of the relationship between housing costs and local wages. While London wages have increased by roughly 30% over the past decade, housing costs have risen by 85%. This divergence has created what economists call a productivity paradox. The more valuable London becomes as an economic center, the less sustainable it becomes as a place for working people to live. The demographic catastrophe. The age profile of London's departing residents tells a particularly troubling story. The city is losing its 28-million 42-year-olds at an unprecedented rate, precisely the demographic that forms families, starts businesses, and drives innovation. What's replacing them? A growing population of retirees, and an increasingly transient group of very high earners who view London as a temporary posting rather than a permanent home. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a demographic researcher at King's College London, has been tracking these shifts with growing alarm. "We're witnessing the creation of a demographic desert," she explains. London is simultaneously becoming older and more transient. The stable, rooted middle class that historically drove the city's culture and civic life is being systematically priced out. The data supports her concerns. Birth rates in London have dropped to their lowest levels since records began, falling 23% between 2020 and 2023. This isn't just about personal choice, it's about the impossibility of raising a family in a city where childcare costs £1,500 per month, and family-sized homes are financially out of reach for all but the wealthiest residents. Meanwhile, the number of residents over 65 has increased by 18% in the same period. These aren't new retirees moving to London for its amenities, they're existing residents aging in place while younger people leave. The result is a city that's graying faster than almost any other major metropolis in the developed world. The international comparison: London's social crisis becomes even starker when compared to other major cities worldwide. Cities like Vienna, Copenhagen, and Singapore have managed to maintain social cohesion while growing economically. Their secret isn't complex. They've prioritized housing as a social necessity rather than a speculative commodity. Vienna's social housing program provides high-quality accommodation for 60% of the city's residents, including middle-class professionals. This isn't stigmatized public housing. It's a universal system that prevents housing costs from consuming excessive portions of residents' incomes. The result is a city where teachers, nurses, and firefighters can afford to live near their workplaces and raise families. Singapore takes a different approach, but achieves similar results. Its Housing Development Board ensures that 80% of residents own their homes through subsidized purchase schemes tied to employment and residency. While the system has limitations, it prevents the complete disconnection between wages and housing costs that characterizes London. Even within Europe, cities like Amsterdam and Berlin have implemented rent controls and social housing requirements that maintain mixed-income neighborhoods. These cities aren't perfect, but they've avoided London's extreme segregation by wealth. The contrast highlights that London's problems aren't inevitable consequences of urban growth. They're the results of specific policy choices that prioritized property speculation over social cohesion. The cultural desert: London's cultural decline extends far beyond venue closures. The city is losing the human infrastructure that creates and sustains culture, the artists, musicians, writers, and cultural workers who generate the creative energy that makes cities exciting. The pattern is visible across all artistic disciplines. Musicians can no longer afford rehearsal spaces or the flexible work arrangements necessary for creative development. Writers and artists face similar impossible economics, forced to choose between their creative work and basic survival. What's particularly tragic is that this cultural decline is happening just as global demand for British creativity reaches new heights. Streaming platforms desperately need content, international audiences embrace British music and fashion, and London's creative reputation still opens doors worldwide. But the infrastructure to develop new talent is being dismantled by economic forces. The replacement is a hollow commercialized culture designed for tourists rather than generated by genuine communities. London increasingly offers expensive simulacra of its former cultural vitality, themed pubs instead of authentic locals, chain restaurants serving artisanal food instead of family-run establishments, and sanitized music venues instead of the chaotic spaces where new movements develop. Young people notice this inauthenticity immediately. They can access more genuine culture in Manchester, Glasgow, or Bristol than in London, where everything feels packaged for consumption rather than created for community. The mental health crisis. The social and economic pressures reshaping London are creating a mental health emergency that the city's healthcare system is completely unprepared to handle. GP practices report unprecedented levels of anxiety and depression, particularly among young adults struggling with housing insecurity and economic uncertainty. Dr. Rachel Kumar, who runs a practice in Hackney, sees the psychological impact daily. I have patients in their 20s and 30s presenting with stress-related illnesses that I used to associate with much older people facing major life crises. But for young Londoners, the major life crisis is just trying to afford basic existence. The housing crisis creates particular psychological pressures. Living in overcrowded, temporary, or unaffordable accommodation generates chronic stress that undermines both physical and mental health. The uncertainty of short-term rental agreements prevents people from forming stable relationships or making long-term plans. Social isolation compounds these problems. When communities fragment and traditional gathering places disappear, people lose the informal support networks that historically helped them cope with stress and adversity. Social media provides connectivity, but not the deep local relationships that build resilience. The irony is devastating. London, one of the world's wealthiest cities, is generating levels of psychological distress comparable to areas experiencing economic collapse or social conflict. The civic engagement collapse democracy requires citizens who feel invested in their communities and confident that their voices matter. London is rapidly losing both conditions. Voter turnout in local elections has declined steadily, particularly among younger residents who correctly perceive that local politics cannot address the fundamental economic forces reshaping their lives. Why vote for better bus services when you can't afford to live near the bus routes? Why engage with planning consultations when development decisions are driven by international capital flows rather than community needs? Why participate in local democracy when the most important decisions affecting your life, housing costs, wage levels, economic opportunities, are determined by global markets, over which local politicians have no influence? The result is a civic disengagement that weakens London's ability to respond collectively to its challenges. Political participation becomes increasingly dominated by older, wealthier residents whose interests often conflict with the broader public good. This democratic deficit has profound implications for London's future. Cities need active, engaged citizenries to maintain social cohesion and adapt to changing circumstances. When civic engagement collapses, cities become increasingly difficult to govern and less responsive to residents' needs. The childhood London lost children growing up in London today experience a fundamentally different city than previous generations. They're more likely to live in overcrowded, temporary accommodation. Their families move frequently, disrupting education and friendships. Their neighborhoods lack the community institutions, youth clubs, libraries, safe public spaces that historically provided opportunities for development and socialization. Perhaps most significantly, they grow up understanding that the city they call home doesn't offer them a future. Bright teenagers correctly perceive that their education and efforts are more likely to pay off elsewhere than in the city where they're being raised. This creates a tragic irony. London invests heavily in educating young people, then watches them leave for opportunities elsewhere because the city can't offer them viable adult lives. It's a system that consumes its own future, using its children's potential to subsidize the lifestyles of wealthy older residents who benefit from property speculation. The psychological impact on children is profound. Growing up with the knowledge that your home city doesn't want or need you creates lasting damage to self-esteem and social connection. London is raising a generation that feels fundamentally disconnected from their place of origin. The tipping point social systems, like physical ones, can appear stable until they suddenly collapse. London may be approaching such a tipping point where the accumulated stress of social fragmentation, economic inequality, and civic disengagement reaches critical levels. The warning signs are everywhere: rising crime in areas where community institutions have collapsed, increasing racial and class tensions as different groups compete for diminishing resources, and growing political extremism as mainstream parties fail to address fundamental problems. International examples suggest that cities can reach points of no return, where social problems become self-reinforcing and resistant to policy interventions. Detroit's collapse, while economically driven, illustrates how quickly urban systems can deteriorate once critical thresholds are crossed. London hasn't reached that point yet, but current trends suggest it's moving in that direction. The question isn't whether London will face a social crisis, it's whether that crisis will catalyze necessary changes or accelerate the city's decline. The next decade will likely determine which path London follows: renewal through genuine reform, or further deterioration into a playground for the wealthy surrounded by zones of deprivation and social breakdown. The path forward: learning from success stories, despite the overwhelming evidence of London's decline, cities around the world prove that urban crises can be reversed through bold, comprehensive action. The question isn't whether London can be saved, it's whether the political will exists to implement the radical changes necessary for recovery. The solutions aren't mysterious or untested. Vienna, Singapore, Copenhagen, and even cities like Montreal and Melbourne have demonstrated that it's possible to maintain urban vitality while ensuring residents can afford to live where they work. Their approaches differ in detail but share common principles: housing as a social right rather than a speculative commodity, mixed-income communities by design, and economic policies that serve residents rather than international capital. Vienna's model is particularly relevant for London. The Austrian capital houses 60% of its residents in social housing that's available to everyone, not just the poor. These aren't grim concrete blocks, but high-quality developments that middle-class professionals actively choose over private rentals. The result is a city where teachers, nurses, and firefighters live alongside lawyers and consultants, creating the social mixing that builds cohesive communities. The economics are straightforward. When housing costs are controlled, residents have more money to spend on local businesses, cultural activities, and services. This creates a virtuous cycle where the local economy strengthens, generating more tax revenue that can fund further improvements. Vienna consistently ranks among the world's most livable cities while maintaining housing costs at reasonable levels. Singapore takes a different approach but achieves similar results. Its Housing Development Board ensures that 80% of residents own their homes through subsidized schemes tied to employment and citizenship. While this system has authoritarian elements unsuitable for London, the principle is clear: when governments prioritize housing for residents over profits for speculators, cities remain affordable and stable. Even within the UK, examples exist. Edinburgh has implemented stricter planning controls that prevent pure speculation while encouraging genuine development. The city isn't perfect, but it's maintained more balanced growth that serves existing residents alongside new arrivals. The choice before London. London stands at a crossroads. One path leads to continued decline, further demographic hollowing, economic extraction, social fragmentation, and cultural decay. This path requires no action. Current trends will continue without intervention, creating a city that's simultaneously more expensive and less livable. The other path requires courage, vision, and sustained political commitment. It means challenging powerful interests, investing substantial public resources, and accepting that transformation won't be immediate or easy. But this path leads to a London that serves its residents rather than exploiting them, that creates value rather than extracting it, and that builds communities rather than fragmenting them. The choice isn't really about housing policy or economic strategy, it's about what kind of city London wants to be: a playground for international capital where ordinary people cannot afford to live, or a genuine global capital that demonstrates how cities can thrive while serving their residents. The window for action is narrowing. Once social systems collapse and communities fragment beyond a certain point, recovery becomes exponentially more difficult and expensive. Detroit's experience shows how quickly urban decline can become irreversible when tipping points are crossed, but London hasn't reached that point yet. The city retains enormous assets: world-class institutions, cultural heritage, economic infrastructure, and human capital. With the right policies and sufficient political will, these assets could be leveraged to create a genuinely sustainable urban future. The question isn't whether London can be saved, it's whether Londoners will choose to save it while they still can. The technical solutions exist, international examples provide roadmaps, and the economic resources are available. What's needed now is the political courage to challenge a system that enriches a few while impoverishing the many. London's future hangs in the balance. The next few years will determine whether one of the world's great cities adapts to serve its people or continues declining into a hollow shell of its former greatness. The choice is still London's to make, but time is running out.